Good afternoon, and welcome to Partners in Project Green's webinar, Moving Towards Circular Construction, Renovation and Demolition, Where to Begin. On behalf of Partners in Project Green team, I would like to thank you all for joining us. We're really excited to host this webinar since circular CRD waste management has been getting a lot of interest, and we had over 100 registrations for this webinar. As a reminder, we will have a Q&A session at the end, so please use the Q&A feature to submit questions to the presenters. If you have any tech issues or would like to chat with fellow attendees, please use the chat feature. The recording and slides will be made available after the webinar. While we meet today on a virtual platform, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we each call home. We respectfully acknowledge that we're situated on the traditional territories and treaty lands, in particular those of the Mississauga Nation, as well as the Anishinaabe of the Williams Treaty First Nations, the Huron-Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee. The land acknowledgement is our reflection of the relationship with the land and the First Nation communities that live on the land. At TRCA, we are stewards of the land and water resources and take this responsibility very seriously, and we're grateful that we are uniquely placed to restore and enhance this relationship. Attendees who may not be familiar with Partners in Project Green, we are a program of the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority, launched in 2008 in collaboration with Toronto Pearson. PPG works to collectively advance social and environmental sustainability through knowledge sharing, technology, and infrastructure implementation, as well as network building. We're open to any business, municipality, or individual who operates within GTA in the regions of Peel, York, and Durham, as well as the City of Toronto. So this is our agenda for today's webinar. We'll start with a few PPG updates. Our first presentation is on Embodied Carbon Management Toolkit by Ryan Zizo from Mantle Developments. This will be followed by a presentation on deconstruction and reclamation audits by Meredith Moore of Ouroboros Deconstruction. And our third presentation is on materials reuse and recovery options in Canada by Darlene Coyle from Partners in Project Green. After the presentations, we'll move to the Q&A session. So here are a few updates from Partners in Project Green. Do join us for a Future-Proof Your Fleet webinar on November 20th. We will have industry leaders share their experience with different low and zero emission vehicle technologies, including EVs and compressed natural gas. So participants will have an opportunity to learn more about the challenges and benefits that come with greening their fleet. We do have the link that's been put into the chat if you're interested to register. Our next webinar that's coming up is a webinar on insurance, and this will be on November 28th. As we all know, climate change presents unique risks and challenges to businesses, and navigating business insurance is certainly one of them. So we've partnered with Insurance Bureau of Canada, and this webinar will cover the basic elements of business insurance and how increasingly severe weather events caused by climate change affect insurance costs. Our final update is that we're excited to relaunch our annual forum next spring. The theme for the forum will be storytelling and how to effectively communicate data and impact of your sustainability project, initiative, or business to different audiences. This will be a full-day event on June 12th, 2025 at Centennial College in Scarborough. Tickets will be live soon, so please do save the date and stay tuned for more updates. Our webinar topic today is moving towards circular construction, renovation, and demolition, where to begin. We're all aware that traditional linear construction, renovation, and demolition processes have large carbon footprints, as well as greenhouse gas emissions from manufacturing, transportation, and waste generation that typically end up in landfill. If we are to reduce our built environment carbon footprint, we need a new way of thinking, and this is a transition to circular construction, renovation, and demolition, or CRD waste management. This will minimize waste as well as optimize resource usage. Many of us are unsure on how to begin the transition to circular CRD waste management practices, and the aim of this webinar is to provide you with a few tools and resources to get started, and we hope to continue to support and facilitate these discussions and initiatives on circular CRD waste management. This brings us to our first poll question. You will see that coming up on your screen. What are the top 3 barriers to circular CRD waste management in Ontario? We'll give you 30 seconds to complete the poll before we move to the introduction of speakers. Charlotte, do bring up the responses when you're ready. We'll take a quick look.
Do I have to end the poll to get the result?
Yes.
Okay. It's still moving, but I'm going to end it. That's okay.
Thank you. So we have 54% for the first one, which is something that we've seen in many different scenarios, which is a lack of knowledge and awareness on processes. The next one is limited markets and services for reuse and recovery, as well as higher costs of processes and products. But there's also at the top challenge was lack of circular building regulations and enforcement, followed by considerations for circularity enter the project too late, which is basically a lack of planning. So thank you all for responding to this poll. This will, I'm sure, help some of our Ryan and Meredith and Darlene as they present their topics. So this is now the time to introduce our speakers. Our first speaker is Ryan Zizo from Mantle Developments. Ryan is the founder and CEO of Mantle Developments, which is a Toronto-based climate change consultancy that's focused on climate-smart infrastructure and buildings. He's a recognized leader in helping large organizations and governments transition to low-carbon future. So his work has directly supported an update to the Toronto Green Standard version 4, and he's also contributed to the Government of Canada standard on embodied carbon in construction. Thank you, Ryan, for joining us today. Our second speaker is Meredith Moore from Ouroboros Deconstruction. She is the founder of Ouroboros Deconstruction, which merges the deep commitment to adaptive reuse and sustainability with extensive expertise in design, construction, and demolition. Recognizing the untapped potential of overlooked materials in today's throwaway culture, she is dedicated to reshaping perceptions and elevating the value of recovered resources. Thank you, Meredith, for joining us. And our third speaker is Darlene Coyle from Partners in Project Green. Darlene coordinates the waste management and water stewardship programs at PPG, and the goal of her work in waste management programs is to support businesses who are members of PPG across the GTA in reducing waste and diverting material from landfill. And one such program is the Material Exchange Program, which she will speak to during her presentation. So again, I would like to thank all our speakers for their time today, and I invite Ryan to start his presentation.
You're muted, Ryan.
Thanks for the heads up. I was just saying thanks, Shaya, and thanks everyone for attending today. I'm looking forward to being part of this session. So just trying to get my full screen here. All right. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about the embodied carbon management toolkit that we're just finalizing with the City of Toronto right now. But I'm going to start with a little bit of a refresher on life cycle assessment and embodied carbon. I think it's important to share about these topics since they're still relatively new in the industry. Although quite a lot of people are aware of embodied carbon and life cycle assessment, it is still relatively new to some folks as well. So this is really, I think, one of the key that helps unlocks the benefits of circularity and material reuse is to be able to speak to the benefits from a carbon perspective. So I'll spend a little bit of time on that before going into the specifics of the toolkit and the recommendations. So I already got a good intro, so thanks for that. But yeah, I've done a lot of work in this space in policy development around embodied carbon with the City of Toronto, the federal government, the Canada Green Building Council, and a number of different private sector actors. So to jump right into the embodied carbon discussion, increasingly we're describing the carbon footprint of buildings as having two aspects. One is the operational carbon emissions, and that's associated with operating the building, so heating, cooling, lighting, ventilation. This is what we've been managing as an industry for the past 15 years, 20 years through energy efficiency requirements in the building code and through decarbonization of the energy system. But we're increasingly realizing that there's a very large carbon footprint with creating the materials and creating the buildings. And that's what we mean when we say embodied carbon emissions. And we want to manage both of these. This graph just shows how the carbon footprint of a typical building has been reduced between the past and now. So these are illustrative in nature, but you can see buildings of the past, as shown on the top, had a significant amount of carbon in year one or year zero during the construction of the materials in the buildings, but then over the 60 years of a building's life cycle, much more carbon gets emitted through that operating of the building than was emitted during the making of the building. That's no longer the case. When we look at new high efficiency buildings today, it looks closer like the bottom of the graph, where the operating carbon has drastically been reduced for a new high efficiency building, because as I said, building codes have required more and more energy efficiency with our buildings and systems, and our energy system has been decarbonizing. So we've got rid of coal, we have more solar on the grid, we have more wind on the grid. When you add all those elements together, we're seeing a massive reduction in operating carbon, but very small change in embodied carbon. And when we look at the smaller time frames of maybe what happens in the next 10 years, when you look at new high efficiency buildings in that shorter time frame, it's almost all embodied carbon that's responsible for the emissions in new high efficiency buildings in low grid environments like Ontario. Put another way, like this graph does, we're reducing operating carbon really effectively, and that means that in the not too distant future, the vast majority of the carbon emissions of a building will be from creating the building, will be the embodied carbon. And this is really why embodied carbon has become such an important topic in the last couple of years. So how do we measure embodied carbon? Through a system or a methodology called life cycle assessment. And this is basically looking at all of the processes that happen for a building, in this case, or through manufacturing of a material. You can apply a life cycle assessment to any process, and it's basically looking at the total carbon emissions associated with all of the stages. And there are a number of guidelines that have recently, and international standards that have recently been introduced to help govern how these life cycle assessments should be done for buildings in Canada. And two of them are shown here by the National Research Council. There's the National Guideline for Whole Building Life Cycle Assessment. And then just a few months ago, the second document was released, which is the Practitioner's Guide. So a very step-by-step approach to how to calculate the embodied carbon of a building. And that thing that's very interesting and relevant to our conversation is if you look on page 29 of that practitioner's guide, there's this paragraph on salvaged and reusing of materials. And it's basically saying if you use a salvaged material or a reused material in a new project, you can count that material as having zero carbon footprint, because basically the carbon associated with that was produced for the initial use of the material in the first version of the building, and typical approach would be that it then goes to landfill. So because we're not doing that typical approach, we're reusing it, we can basically account for it as a zero carbon footprint. So this is a very important finding and clause here that is, again, this is the first year that this has been out there in the open, but we can now point to this and use it as justification for reusing materials as a zero carbon footprint, and it can greatly reduce the embodied carbon calculations of a project. And we're also seeing policy. I won't get into the details of all the policy out there on this. I don't have enough time on this talk, but Toronto, Vancouver, Mississauga, various municipalities across Canada are now introducing embodied carbon regulations and limits, right? So you can't actually get a building approval unless you're below a certain embodied carbon threshold. As those caps come down over time, and it's increasingly hard to hit them as we have to do more and more to be low embodied carbon, using more salvage material will be one of the best ways to do that. One of the most cost-effective ways to reduce your carbon footprint because it counts as a zero carbon on your calculations. So that's the quick summary on LCA and embodied carbon. I'll talk specifically about this toolkit that we've developed over the last few months, well, more than a few months now. It's been about a year and a half that we've been working on this project. My team at Mantle and Kelly Doran's team at Half Climate Design has worked with the City of Toronto, including funding through the Atmospheric Fund. And we basically looked at how embodied carbon could be reduced through 3 different lenses that haven't been looked at previously in the Toronto area before. We wanted to look at how urban design can actually impact embodied carbon. So how things like amount of underground parking or amount of overhangs or step backs of a building. Those are all urban design requirements, but all of them have unintended embodied carbon impacts. So Half looked into that. And then my team at Mantle looked into the items 2 and 3, which was procurement of low carbon materials. So setting some requirements around what a low carbon material might look like in terms of purchasing. But the third one, which is relevant to this discussion, was around circularity and basically how to value the carbon footprint in existing structures and materials and think about ways that the city could promote reuse of buildings and reuse of materials. So as part of this process, we looked at what Toronto's currently doing, what are best practices globally around these topics. We had working groups with dozens of people from different City of Toronto divisions that were part of this and discussed, what best practices are out there and how Toronto might be able to implement them. So we've come up with some recommendations that I'll give you just some of the highlights of today. And when we say circular construction, I really like this simple graph, which kind of really shows that what we mean in a simple way. Instead of just making something, using it in one building's life, and then putting it to the landfill, we want to think about how we can increasingly reuse both the building itself and repurpose a building. But if a building does need to come down, maybe to do it in a thoughtful way to deconstruct it and then to reuse all those materials. So moving from the left to the right into a more circular economy. And some of you may have seen this hierarchy of zero carbon design and what we can do from a design perspective to reduce the carbon footprint of our buildings. And one of the most effective things we can do is to build less, to use less material and to reuse what we already have, right? It's something that we know how to do, we can do it, but our processes aren't set up in a way to incentivize that. And we do have some, circularity in Toronto. I think anyone that's, driven around downtown Toronto will recognize these slides here or similar buildings that have done this type of facadism of saving a facade. This is really good from a heritage perspective. That's why this is being done to preserve heritage. And, I would argue it's not very good at all from a carbon perspective. Think about the carbon footprint of all of that steel that they're using to hold up this facade. It's likely many times more than the carbon footprint of the brick that they're reusing. So, I'm not saying we shouldn't be doing this, but I'm saying if we're going to do this, let's save the structure behind the building as well. Let's save as much of the building as we can and try to find ways to reanimate it and bring it back to life, as opposed to just demolishing everything, but investing a huge amount of carbon to save the facade, right? We can do better than this. And the more I looked into this, dug into this issue over the past year and a half, the more I realized that there are many co-benefits with circularity. I started looking at it from a carbon perspective, but I realized that, it really supports local jobs. It improves cultural heritage. It lowers carbon as I knew, but also has much less waste. So there's many benefits associated with reduced landfill impacts, means we need to use less resource extraction to create new materials, and it can lead to faster construction if we can find ways to streamline what's already there instead of going through a whole demolition process and a rezoning and a rebuilding, which can take many, many years. So the more I learned about this, the more I became a convert and realized there's many co-benefits to successful circularity strategies. So just to touch on some of the very high level recommendations that we proposed to the city. One is to support ways to have more adaptive reuse of buildings. So instead of demolishing a building, finding ways to incentivize people to use what's there and reimagine them. And one way, one example is that this picture on the bottom of the slide. This is an actual building in Toronto, 488 University Avenue, where there was this existing office tower you can see on the left-hand side. And the site, they wanted to densify. Sorry, I've got a lot of light coming on my face. I'll just close this. There we go. This building, they basically took down the shell, put up a temporary cladding, put an exoskeleton on top of that, and then put a transfer structure on it, and then built about 35 stories of residential on top. That was all done well. The building was still occupied. So people were working in this office building while they did this, and they hugely densified the site and basically avoided all of the carbon footprint associated with having to demolish and rebuild what was already there just to get a taller tower. So we see these examples are possible, but these are definitely not the standard approach right now. So the idea of this is to have the city think about ways to support this so that this type of solution can become the standard approach. Things like having financial incentives, waiving, certain rezoning requirements that might be required, or, shadow requirements that might be required. There's many things that the city could do to unlock these types of developments or incentivize them further. Another really interesting thing we saw, especially from leading jurisdictions like New York City and London in the UK, was the requirement of pre-development and or pre-demolition audits. So before a project was approved to be redeveloped or to be demolished, for example, certain projects in those jurisdictions were required to do this audit. They can be called circularity audits. There's a number of different terms used, but the idea is, looking at what's there in a systematic way, recording it, and coming up with a plan to maximize the reuse of those things so that it's a condition of your approval that you have to do this and you have to have a strong plan. I'll point out that there is this last point on the slide here. There is an existing regulation that requires some of this in Ontario called Ontario Regulation 102/94, but most people don't know about it, and it's very, very poorly enforced. I noted that the top two things on that voting at the start was lack of awareness education and lack of regulation, right? So this kind of ties into both of those, that there's a lack of awareness about regulation in many of these places. And for example, the city of Toronto says, well, this is a provincial requirement, so it's not up to us to enforce it. And when I speak to the people at the province, they said, well, we just do random enforcement on this, and we have, we look at a couple dozen projects a year to see if they're following it. And they said, most people are not in compliance with this requirement. So there are, I would suggest one of the things anyone that's involved in building approvals can do or involved in projects is follow this regulation because it's already there, and think about how we can, really maximize what's already being asked for by the province. There's also a really interesting approach we saw called the circularity decision tree, which you can, depending on the state of the building or the site, you ask a number of questions about, is the structure sound, is there cultural heritage here, a number of questions that can lead to guidance on whether it makes sense to retain and retrofit the building, do a partial retrofit and refurbishment, or do a disassemble and reuse, or potentially a demolish and recycle. So we were suggesting you could have a kind of decision tree like this, and then link, if you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, quote unquote, by the decision tree, then you get a low development fee, or you get some kind of a refund. You're doing the low carbon approach. If, for example, the tree says retain and refurbish, but you're actually proposing a demolition, then maybe you have a 10 times a fee, for example, right? So again, linking financial incentives to the lower carbon option. And then also we could talk about just banning demolition and having deconstruction and salvage instead. And that's what Meredith is going to talk more about. But we see more than five, I think it's more than 6 or 7 municipalities now in North America that have done this. They banned demolition and require the deconstruction. So we went into some detail with the city on what specific building permits, municipal code, bylaws, things that they should revise if they were interested in moving forward with this. We can also require more the market development of secondary materials. So that was something that we heard from the project partners and Project Green team, and I think when Meredith can speak a little bit more to as well. Or if you're doing procurement of new buildings, thinking about requiring a minimum amount of salvage material. So it would be an easy procurement requirement to say, 1% of materials on this project should come from a reused or salvage source, and ratcheting that up over time. These types of requirements in procurement documents would benefit or would require would provide more demand or induce demand for these types of materials in the market. So very interesting policy decisions that could be made through that, or impacts could be made through that. This is just a slide I just got the other day from someone working on a structural steel reuse project at the Parliament buildings in Ottawa, the Center Block, where they're taking out structural steel, having them refinished, new connections put in, and then reusing them in the structure. And they're finding that it's basically a 93% reduction to reuse when they're reusing the steel versus an average steel from other mills. If it's a blast furnace new production of steel, then it's a 97% reduction. So we're talking about massive carbon savings by reusing these materials. And then just finally to say this toolkit is going to be published on our website within the next week or two. It's not there right now. There are some preliminary findings on the website now, but we're just waiting for the final approval from the Atmospheric Fund, the funder, to put it up there. So feel free to check back at our website in a couple of weeks or reach out to me by email, and I'd be happy to send it to you once it's available. So I'm going to end it there, and we can take some questions, I believe, after, but I'll hand it over to Meredith now. So thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen. All right. Can everyone see it?
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. So as Ryan mentioned in Chaya, my name is Meredith Moore. I'm the founder of Ouroboros Deconstruction, and I'm excited to be here today to talk to you about deconstruction and material reuse and how it can play a part in making construction circular. So the image on the screen is a common sight in many neighborhoods around Toronto and really throughout Canada. Currently in Toronto, we have over 2,700 active demolition permits. And I read a statistic yesterday that said both in 2022 and 2023, we saw a 30% increase year after year for residential demolition permits that were pulled. And for reference, the demolition of a 2,000 square foot home produces about 140,000 pounds of waste, or the equivalent of one person's lifetime waste production, which is an incredible amount of material that is just ending up in the landfill right now. This volume of material represents not only a loss of economic value, but it creates a demand on the solid waste management system, and it's a driver for increased consumption of virgin materials. To try to combat this problem, I started Ouroboros in 2022 with the goal of creating a full circle approach to material recovery. I chose the Ouroboros because I'm a bit of an art historian nerd, and it's a perfect symbol of what our company does. Through the careful dismantling of buildings, we recover valuable materials and we give them a new life. I really like the idea of self-cannibalization or using the existing building stock as a resource to feed new creations. At Ouroboros, our goal is simple. We want to make deconstruction cost-effective and accessible, and we're aiming to change the way demolition is conducted so that materials are salvaged and widely available as a resource within the community. We work across the field of residential, commercial, and large-scale redevelopment, and we run the gamut on projects from small selective interior deconstructions to reclamation audits to full-scale structural decons. While demolition is now the standard, it wasn't always this way. Before World War II, deconstruction or hand demolition was the norm, and materials were carefully salvaged for their economic and practical value. The shift to mass demolition in the 40s prioritized speed over existing resource preservation. But during a deconstruction, we're carefully dismantling the building in stages, and I like to say we're taking as much care removing the materials as the initial trades did who installed them. And by dismantling the building in stages, where we're starting with interior finishes and moving on to the structure, we're really maximizing salvage potential and ensuring non-salvaged items are sorted for higher recycling rates, which help us to achieve around a 90% diversion rate from landfill on all of our projects. Our deconstruction projects typically employ 5 people on site daily. offering low barrier job opportunities. And we are very proud that our team is 50% men and women, so it's a great way for us to help get more women into the trades. A traditional demolition is very disruptive to the community. They're noisy, they produce a lot of dust and airborne pollutants. Deconstruction is very different. We often have neighbors come up to the job site and just thank us for what we're doing. They're calmed by seeing that even though the building is coming down, that these materials are going to be reused and live on in some way. Where demolition is part of the linear make-take waste life cycle, deconstruction is part of the circular economy. Here you see my team in the various aspects of a full circle approach to material economy. We see the audit stage, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, deconstruction and salvage, transport, processing, storage. I just realized that I should really have another bubble here for specification and design, and then reuse. I think you get the point that if this is done correctly, materials could be reused long past the point of the original building coming down, and depending on the material type, could really be reused in perpetuity. We see deconstruction as a vehicle to get to the materials for reuse. To understand what kind of material we're dealing with on our projects and what it's going to be used for, we always start with a reclamation audit, or what Ryan called a pre-demolition audit. A reclamation audit identifies materials with high reuse potential in buildings slated for demolition. These audits document the dimensions, quantities, the conditions, environmental impact of materials, and they help us to create detailed inventories. These inventories then go on to serve multiple purposes. They're informing building owners and designers about on-site reuse opportunities. They help us advertise our salvage materials to different professionals, and then they guide the demolition or deconstruction team through the project to make sure that the building is dismantled carefully and the materials that will be salvaged for reuse are taken out carefully. And what we find is that they support decision-making for effective reclamation. They really start the conversation between the project stakeholders. To better illustrate the process, I'd like to do a bit of a deep dive into the North York YMCA project, which we are very lucky to be working with Ryan and his team at Mantle Developments on. This project really highlights how collaboration and early engagement can help maximize material reuse. We're working with the YMCA leadership, we're working with Mantle, the project architects, and the engineers, and through all of us, it's helped to identify materials with high reuse potential across their various campuses and in the new build. And what we found is that the North York YMCA offers an incredible opportunity for material reuse. It was built in 1979, and it had some subsequent renovations after. There are extensive exterior grounds and tons of different types of materials to work with. We identified about 20, but when we later walked the campus with the engineering and architecture team, they were able to identify even more that could go into the new design. We found about 80,000 concrete dry set pavers that were looking for a new home, and we might have found vintage and modern light fixtures, gym flooring, acoustic panels, and many different types of structural steel. When considering which materials to reuse, we prioritize 3 factors: environmental impact, easy to reuse items, and materials with cultural significance, like the iconic brick synonymous with the YMCA's identity. When we were walking the YMCA, we had a few different gym members come up to us and explain to us what an impact this space had had on their lives. They had brought their children here when they were younger. In retirement, they were going here daily. And they were really happy to know, once again, that even though this YMCA wasn't going to remain standing, that the materials could go on, and that maybe they could see some of the brick that they were so familiar with and associated so many memories with be reused in the new design. We also considered deconstruction potential and how items could be reused, and the recycling pathways. For instance, vinyl wall base is easily removed and could be reused with minimal reprocessing, but there are really very few recycling options for it right now, and it has a pretty high embodied carbon impact. So this made it a perfect candidate for reuse. Through on and off-site reuse and other diversion tactics, the items we identified in this project have the ability to make a really big impact. Reusing these materials is equivalent to the greenhouse gas emissions from driving over 1,000 gasoline-powered cars for a year. And what we found is that by involving the stakeholders early, we have started to effectively plan for harvesting, storage, and reuse. And we've already started to talk to different companies and government entities to figure out places that we could deploy these materials. Obviously, 80,000 pavers is an incredible number of pavers to find a new home for, but we are really excited that we started to, I think, at least divert half of that to another project. So after a reclamation audit, the next challenge is finding these reuse pathways for the materials that won't be reused on site. And building strong networks is essential, and many are still really informal. Regional marketplaces for reusable materials have grown, but there's not really a unified system out there to sell this material. And regulatory hurdles like recertification also limit the reuse. One way that we're starting to address these regulatory hurdles is that we have developed we've developed recertification for our salvage lumber. So our lumber regrading process has really been a game changer for us. It's allowed us to take wood from our deconstruction projects, have it regraded to meet the certification requirements for structural reuse. And we worked with a local builder who helped us develop this process and then reuse this lumber for a laneway suite that they're currently building. It's been signed off. They've been issued all of their permits and the inspector has been through. So we're really excited to have a case study that we're studying with ECCC to show that this is viable material. When we're not using our lumber for structural purposes, quite a bit of it is repurposed into products such as flooring, furniture, and decorative finishes. Here you see it being reused by some artisans and also as wall paneling. We are also working with artists who are looking to incorporate salvage materials into their designs. This is from University of Waterloo for winter stations. And then material that generally we would have sent to recycling. We're starting to look at different ways to reprocess. We've started to work with local manufacturers of NLT, nail laminated timber. We worked with a colleague, Haley Anderson, to start figuring out biochar, which is a soil additive from basically offcuts from our lumber that goes through a slow burn. And it can keep a large amount of carbon. It also has nitrogen and other things that farmers are really in need of. And then we start to bring in large-scale chippers into some of our projects so that the material can just stay on site. We basically chip down the offcuts that would have otherwise gone for recycling. We use large-scale magnets, and then they can go into landscaping or other backfill. So to finish, some of the key market challenges facing reuse organizations in deconstruction right now. For most deconstruction companies operating in urban centers, warehousing space is a really big problem for us, which is something that Ryan touched on. The infrastructure is really lacking in places to start storing these materials, and that's something we have to start thinking about as we operate at scale. Recycling partners where we know that our materials are going to be going to secondary markets. It's always difficult for us depending on the project and the timeline. Recycling is a bit of a commodity market. And so most of the time wood gets recycled, but we've had projects where we've had partners say, oh, actually, there's not a good price for it right now. So it's not going to be recycled. Obviously, we didn't work with them, but it's always something where we're calling and looking for reliable partners to work with. In Toronto right now, we don't have any kind of incentives or mandates for deconstruction, and we're up against very efficient and cost-effective demolition companies. So any types of incentives that can be sent, whether that's expediting deconstruction permits or some of the other incentives Ryan talked about, would be hugely helpful. And then also just kind of reframing this idea around material reuse. There's a lot of regulatory red tape on certification. And so helping to make that process less opaque and getting people more comfortable, engineers, designers, architects, with reusing material is something that we all have to work on. That's my contact information, and I look forward to the questions. I'm going to pass it on to Darlene now.
Awesome. Thank you, Meredith, for that presentation. That was hugely informative and actually a very good segue to this presentation too. So let me just share my screen again. Perfect. So hi everyone, my name is Darlene. I will be talking very briefly just about some of the material reuse and recovery options that we have seen in Canada so far. So reuse marketplaces are common enough for the individual person. However, actually many of us are probably familiar and may even use some of these to get rid of unwanted household items. However, when it comes to common construction and building materials on a corporate scale, our options can get quite limiting. So in this presentation, I'll be going over some of the marketplaces that work with construction waste and that we have found just from a quick industry search. I should mention that this is not going to be an exhaustive list. We just simply don't have time for that. But we'll discuss some of the ones that we're aware of. And if there's any that you're aware of that I don't mention, please put it in the chat. And I'd love to see some discussions about how your experiences have been with those. So each of the marketplaces I'll be discussing are similar but different. There are some that have annual paid memberships. Some might include perks to receiving material. Others have a physical or online store that you can shop and browse like any retail experience. Others require an online profile that can be made before using their free service. There are also different ways of receiving material, which I'll get to in a minute. Some offer materials for free. Others require you to negotiate with the vendors to determine a price. Others will just list the price right there, just like any normal shop. So the first one I'm going to talk about is Partners in Project Green's material exchange program. I should preface this service that this isn't a program that organizations should be looking to get any revenue for their materials. These items are to be offered for free as it emphasizes some of the social and equity aspects of our program, which I'll explain in a little bit. So the Material Exchange Program, also referred to as MEX, facilitates the exchange of material generated from our PPG members across the GTA to divert waste from landfill and move towards a circular economy. So through this program, businesses and nonprofit organizations provide information about material they would like to either offer or receive, and PPG staff facilitate interactions between participants to complete and promote successful exchanges. We do prioritize material going to local community and nonprofit organizations first, and then to other organizations who could potentially use it before turning to recyclers. We had previously tried an online kind of browse and shop kind of model, but found that without the facilitation aspect, members would often get busy or sidetracked, and the exchange would just fall apart. So we play a very active role in the outreach and facilitation of those exchanges. So this program accepts various types of material, such as office supplies and equipment, textiles, organic materials, operational materials, and we're looking to build a network of organizations that have a capacity to take building and construction materials. And this has been in response to some of the conversations that we've had with our members. So the acceptance criteria is really only limited by our own imagination and the imagination of the organizations receiving materials. The program has been going on since about 2013, And I've included a few metrics here just to give a little bit of idea of the impact of the program so far. So in a 10-year span, we've managed to divert over 18,000 tons of material from landfill, avoiding about 43,000 tons of carbon, and organizations submitting and diverting material saves some money through avoiding a tipping costs, but the real financial impact here is really with the organizations receiving material that don't have to buy brand new. And this equates to about $3.5 million for those organizations. And so although organizations might not be getting revenue from giving materials away, the social impact is huge, not only to the individual organizations receiving material, but the impact on the community as a whole. So we make a considerable effort to prioritize exchanges with organizations that serve equity deserving populations first before reaching out to other organizations and recyclers. And we're proud to note that about 74% of exchanges from about 2022 till now have gone to such groups so far. I've included on the slide a few of the nonprofits that have benefited from this program, and this list continues to grow. So this includes food banks, youth centers, women's groups, newcomer centers, homeless shelters, affordable housing services, just to name a few. And so 2 examples of how we've worked with organizations to support their waste diversion efforts on large-scale projects. The first is with TMU during their rebranding, in which over 11 tons of material was diverted from landfill using a combination of reuse, upcycling, and recycling. And so we played a part in sending some material to shelters and sewing groups in order to reuse and upcycle some material. The second case study is with the City of Mississauga and their renovation of the Hazel McCallion Central Library. And so using a combination of internal reuse, the material exchange program, and recycling, the program diverted over 120 tons of material from landfill. And so we played a part in getting some of those furniture pieces reused. So just some other marketplaces that we're aware of. The first one is the Reuse Marketplace, delivered by Circular Partners, who is a longstanding PPG member located in Toronto. I think I saw some of them in the audience today, so giving a shout out to some of them. This is an online and physical store where you can browse for a wide variety of items. And this includes flooring, construction material, textiles, and smaller quantities of unique items. And so anyone is able to submit and receive materials at a cost. However, there are some perks to their paid membership, including discounts on items and then first dibs on some of the materials that they have. The third example, I think many of us have heard of Habitat for Humanity's Restore, but did you know that they also carry some construction materials? I didn't. It's really dependent on the individual store, but you can shop online and see what each of them have. Just the quantities and the types of materials will depend on the location itself. So it's very similar to any online shopping experience, like any retail store. No membership is required. You kind of just go in, pay for the materials that you want, and then you're all good to go. The next one is Get Fill. This is a free app in which organizations can find businesses in Southern Ontario that are offering or accepting material. As you can imagine, they specialize in fill, get it, soils, concrete, asphalt, brick, that sort of thing. And as you can see from the screenshot, you can search by address, material type, listing type, and you'll see on the map exactly where these locations are in relation to your office. It is free to sign up, but there are businesses who are offering these materials, so there will be costs associated with receiving materials and transporting the material to their site. The last example that we have before we move to Q&A is the Building Material Exchange Program offered by Lighthouse. This is over on Vancouver Island. It is free to sign up. However, costs of acquiring the materials are to be negotiated with the vendors themselves. BMEX is simply just a matchmaking platform, which allows organizations to connect with construction and manufacturing businesses. There are plans to have an online shopping platform similar to Facebook Marketplace and Craigslist. That'll be coming in the next little while. And I turn it over to the audience. Let's grow this list. Those that are aware of some secondary markets, please feel free to put them in the chat. As I said before, this is not an exhaustive list of marketplaces, so if you know of any, we encourage you to share some of your experiences. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Chaya to facilitate the Q&A.
Thanks, Darlene. There are actually a couple that have been entered in the chat. This green salvaged materials that has a marketplace for building and structural materials. Thank you, Carly, for putting in that link. And there's also reuse wood. Thank you, Katie, for entering that. Okay, so now we have about 10 minutes for the Q&A section. We do have a few questions that have been put into the chat. I would remind everyone to, again, use the Q&A feature if you can for any questions that come up for all our presenters. So I'll get started immediately on the first few that have been put into the chat. So I think this was answered by Ryan, but just in the interest of the larger group, learning more about this question, does adding solar to a building add to the embodied carbon? May I request all our presenters to turn on their video? And Ryan, if you could answer that question, I think you have.
Yeah, hi. I did actually, I'll just open up the graphic because I went and referred to my notes because I wanted to show you, I wanted to make sure I was giving you the right number. Oh yeah, it's right here. Let me just share my screen. So this was a City of Toronto project we did 2 years ago, and we basically did this exact analysis where we looked at the carbon footprint of solar. So basically without, you can see this okay, without the solar, the embodied carbon of the building was this gray line. And then when we added the operational carbon, that's the yellow line. So you can see the carbon footprint of the building goes up over time as the operations go in. When we added solar, it increased the embodied to here. So this was the difference, right? This carbon footprint of adding solar, but the total carbon went down every year because we were offsetting some of the energy use. So basically after year 7, the solar version of the project was lower carbon than the non-solar version of the project. And then even when we replaced solar in year 20, you can see a jump there. That's when we put in all new solar panels. But we still, still ultimately, this was the change between the solar and the non-solar project. So it was about 7 years on this project to be a lower carbon with the solar option.
Thanks, Ryan. I think you've answered that question. I think the second one is for Meredith. Where do salvaged materials get stored until their next use?
We have a warehouse we currently operate out of. So if they're not being stored on site to be reused in the new design, then they come back to our warehouse with us, and we're located in Leslieville.
Okay. And so we have other marketplaces as well that have storage space. So certainly there is some, although I do understand that that is quite the barrier. Storage can become a barrier over a period of time. So we'll have to solve that issue as well.
Absolutely.
The next question.
Yeah, and that was one of the things that we discussed with the City of Toronto, and they actually they seemed to have some potential interest in helping with that. They said one thing the city has is space, right? They do have lands and old buildings that they could potentially repurpose. So if just to share that with the team, if anyone has the need for that type of space, reach out to me and I can maybe connect you with some of the folks I have been speaking to at the city about this.
Thanks, Ryan. Another question, I think, again, to Meredith. Where are you selling salvaged material? Is there a good market for them?
So we have a website. We are in the process of updating the shop in our website because I wouldn't say it's 100% accurate with our inventory. we are a relatively newer company and we are doing both deconstruction and material sales. So it's a lot to take on. We really look forward to there being just a wonderful marketplace for this that's established and everyone can turn to. We have a great network that we built up over the last 2 years of partners that are buying material. Now that we're starting to sell material, graded lumber, we're able to sell it more on scale, which has been really helpful. So we're looking for more processes we can put in place where we're selling the material on scale versus kind of one-off Facebook Marketplace exchanges, because those are not efficient.
Yeah, and Meredith and I are working on these YMCA projects, as she mentioned, and they are a different scale than previous projects. These are two huge institutional, health and fitness centers, and the Y is all in on this topic. They're like, yeah, let's do it. So now it's up to us, I think, including anyone on the call. This is a show, a call out for help. We have a big opportunity here, and we need to figure out how to realize that opportunity. So we're going to need partners. We're going to need, funders, deconstructors, salvage organizations, reuse marketplace. Like these could really be, in my opinion, these could really be the things to catalyze this marketplace in the GTA, because we've got two massive YMCAs that are real potential for this.
Yeah, I think what's so special about these is just the scale of the material. We talked about the 80,000 pavers. So, that's 1,000 pavers to 80 projects. And, that's awesome, because you're really only right now, the way that we have to advertise our materials, it's a lot of one-offs. Whereas in this project, we can, do it on scale. So it's really exciting to see.
Okay, thank you. There's another question here, wondering if anyone has experience with applying embodied carbon consideration into linear construction projects, for example, transit corridors, road redesigns.
Applying embodied carbon, what concentration did you say?
Applying embodied carbon considerations into linear construction project.
Right. Yeah, so the city has a working group that's looking at this. The procurement, so I said there were 3 topics we looked at in our management toolkit. One of them that I didn't touch on was procurement. And that basically was how they could set embodied carbon caps on the materials that they purchase. And that's relevant to infrastructure, linear infrastructure. So in that toolkit, we do provide recommendations on low carbon concrete, low carbon steel, and other materials, asphalt included. So the city is definitely looking at that. They have already updated some of their policies around concrete to use lower carbon versions of concrete. The federal government as well has something called the Standard on Embodied Carbon in Construction, which is a low carbon ready mix concrete requirement, which applies to any infrastructure using ready mix concrete.
Okay, all right. There's a second question here for Meredith. Regarding storage, how do you maintain inventory of the items in your storage space? And do you have a time period you will keep items for?
We have an online database that we use for our inventorying system. We're trying to tie that into our website currently, which is the issue. And for the most part, no, we don't have a time period. We definitely, if we've had something for a long time, we drop the price to get it to move, because we are limited by the amount of space we have. And the more deconstructions we do, the more material we have. So at a certain point, we start dropping prices. But for the most part, we give it away before it would go to landfill.
Okay. Thanks. In the interest of time, I'm aware we just have 2 minutes, but we do have a few questions that have come in. We can continue to answer these. Ryan and Meredith, if you are okay with staying on for a few more minutes.
Sure.
Thank you. Okay, so the next question is, how does taking circularity into account change the project schedule? Are you building extra time into larger projects like the YMCA, and is the client fine to pay for extra time?
Take that.
Me?
For schedule? Well, I mean, I can talk to the fact that that's why I said we need many partners. One of them needs to be a funder, because the Y is willing to put some money into this. They realize it's the right thing to do, but it's really not a cost-effective thing for them to do right now. So paying a little bit to Meredith and I to try to see if we can get something off the ground, but we would need a bigger funder to support the circularity initiative, I think.
Yeah, and I think also what they're looking right now, they're looking for cost-effective measures where they can start um, using circularity. So certain materials we've looked at, we understand that they wouldn't add a lot of time or cost to the project, but they would be effective. For our projects for residential deconstructions, we find that yes, our clients are willing to have, an additional day to a week added to their timeline. And whether there's an additional cost, then yes, they're willing to pay that. But right now, we're very much a selective service. So it's not something that everyone is opting into at the moment.
And in terms of the timing piece, I think I would say, like, as long as it's planned for in advance, it doesn't necessarily have to impact schedule, right, Meredith? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the next question is the City of Toronto enforcing any recycling regulations or any state?
Recycling in terms of construction and demolition related recycling, there is a requirement to send construction waste away from landfill as part of the Toronto Green Standard. So yes, there are some requirements there, but that's just for the new construction. It's not related to the demolition aspect. There is Ontario regulation, a provincial regulation that requires materials to not go to landfill, but it's not very robust and it's not very well implemented.
Okay.
And I would also say most of that only applies to ICI or commercial projects. You see very little regulation in residential demolition.
Okay, the next question is a little long. What are some current building material impact data sources that are being created alongside researchers? I just came off a webinar by Habitable in the US highlighting healthy materials, which is another co-benefit in the context of plastic pollution of building materials. The data research is primarily US based, and it would be good to have your thoughts.
I know in the States, the EPA recently granted quite a few different organizations their multiple millions of dollars. And so they're starting to establish EPDs for salvage material that those should probably be released within the next year or two. There, as far as a carbon accounting for it, as Ryan mentioned, I believe it's just a 0 in most projects. But yeah.
Yeah, and I would say, if you want to learn more about that, Google like Healthy Materials Passport, I believe is what it's called. So there are organizations that are focused on the other environmental impacts of materials. So those are other things that can be calculated from a life cycle assessment as well. One of the impact categories is the embodied carbon or the global warming potential, but there are other impact categories like acidification or eutrophication or toxicity that various different environmental impacts can be calculated through an LCA. So there are other groups focused on those other non-carbon environmental impacts.
Okay. The next couple of questions are for Meredith. What are some of the tests that are done to ensure the strength and durability of reused materials, and do you certify the reports?
So we work with a Canadian softwood inspector and then a structural engineer that then signs off on it before it goes in for permitting. It's all done by third parties. We aren't involved in the regrading process or the recertification. It's not done by machines. It's all done by eye, which we understand has been signed off in Toronto, but other deconstruction and reuse organizations have not had as linear of a path in other locations. So everything has been done by the book here, but I understand that in different localities, it's not as straightforward.
You actually answered my next question, which was who does the regrade and is it a machine you own? So thank you so much for that. I don't see any other questions come through in the chat or the Q&A. I think I've covered them all. Thank you so much for staying over the webinar time. So thank you again for your informative presentations as well as all the Q&A. And thank you to the audience for such an engaging Q&A session. And we look forward to more conversations. I know when we did the poll, one of the top barriers that was listed was lack of knowledge and awareness, and we hope that this webinar would help reduce that barrier to some extent, and we hope to continue to offer these webinars and support to reduce the other barriers as well. So thank you, everyone, and have a great afternoon.